Is there a message of necessity at the desk? There is a message of necessity at the desk. Move to accept the message of necessity. The message is accepted.
Hello, and welcome back to Messages of Necessity, the Empire Center's podcast. I am Ken Girardin, Empire Center's Research Director, and today we're going to be joined by my colleague, Bill Hammond. He's our Senior Fellow for Healthcare Policy, and probably the one person in New York doing a really good job at keeping an eye on the state's Medicaid program. We're going to be talking today about the Medicaid program, what it is, what makes it so costly, and why we should be keeping an especially close eye on it going into next year's state budget. So without further ado, Bill, thanks for joining us again.
My pleasure.
So Bill, what is Medicaid?
It's the safety net health plan. It's intended for low-income people, people with disabilities, people with significant healthcare needs who can't afford to pay for their own coverage. It's jointly sponsored with the federal government. The federal government pays at least half of the cost and often a lot more. But every state gets to customize it to their own preferences. And so they have a lot of control within federal guidelines. They have a lot of control over how broad, how many people can qualify and what menu of benefits there are. New York has traditionally gone with a broad, generous program that covers a lot of people and covers the full menu of benefits. And as a result, we have the most expensive program in the country on a per capita basis. It's scheduled to cost in total over $100 billion this year. And that includes a lot of federal aid, so about a little over half of that is federal aid. But then there's a big share from the state, and there's also a share from the counties and New York City.
And when people are making comparisons between New York's budget and Florida's budget or Texas's budget, and they're seeing New York spending, in some instances, close to double what those states are, the biggest piece of that is Medicaid. It's the combination of the state, local, and federal funding that really puts New York up into low Earth orbit for total spending. And when we talk about
our one comparison that gets made a lot is that our Medicaid spending is roughly equal to that of Texas and Florida combined. And Texas and Florida are both bigger states than New York. So it's partly a matter of the fact that they are red states who chose not to do the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, but it's also just partly because New York is just very aggressive when it comes to Medicaid.
Well, and you're forgetting the weather too, all those ski injuries as well. But when we talk about the eligibility criteria, how many New Yorkers are we talking about when we talk about the people covered by Medicaid?
So right now it's over a third of the state. In New York City, it's close to half of the population is enrolled in Medicaid. It's somewhere in the vicinity of 8 million. It's a little under 8 million actually in the most recent tally. And that's one of the reasons why we have such an expensive program is that we cover so many people. We cover a larger share of our population than all but 2 other states. And those other states are New Mexico and Louisiana, which are, high poverty states. New York's poverty level is about average. So that's one reason why our program is so expensive. We also have high healthcare costs. So each of those enrollees is costing an average of almost $12,000. And again, that's higher than all but 5 other states. So if you combine those two things, big enrollment and high spending per enrollee, you just get a very expensive program. I like to do a calculation on a per capita basis. So like spending for every resident of the state. And in that category, we're number 1, and we have been for quite a few years now.
You had a great blog post a few weeks ago diving into this and showing how New York stacks up and how New York was spending almost double those backwards, tight-fisted red states such as New Jersey and Illinois. I'd encourage people to
Yeah.
go find that blog post and see just it's really striking. You don't believe it until you see it, just where New York's Medicaid spending level is, until you see it stacked up against the other 49 states. So
I look at a lot of comparative data between states. New York is a big state, and that tends to make us average because we're big. We have a little bit of every type of person there is and every type of problem there is. And so normally the people at the far ends, either at the low end or the high end, are going to be the small states with quirky situations like Hawaii and Alaska. For New York to be at the extreme end of something is a sign of, state policy really driving that situation. Another thing I should mention is that when the Affordable Care Act passed in 2010, its kind of stated goal was to make Medicaid much broader and more generous. New York was already where the Affordable Care Act wanted states to be. And so you might have expected that as other states took the deal of the Medicaid expansion, accepted additional federal aid and expanded their Medicaid programs, that they would catch up or even surpass New York's spending level. But New York has found ways to increase its spending just as much as those other states did, and that's why it's maintained its status as the most expensive Medicaid program on a per capita basis.
well, you talked about how many people are eligible for coverage under New York Medicaid. Talk a little more about the type of care and the type of programs that the state offers through Medicaid that really set us apart here. You've been doing a really good job keeping track of what's known as the personal care component of Medicaid. Tell us a little bit about that.
So unlike most health insurance, Medicaid covers long-term care. It covers the stuff that commercial health insurance covers, namely covers doctor visits, hospitals, procedures, drug when you go to the pharmacy and get your prescriptions filled. Those are what's called acute care. But on top of that, Medicaid really is the only program that covers long-term care, meaning when you are either permanently disabled or you're disabled for more than a few months, either by an illness or some injury or maybe due to a congenital condition. But you need a nursing home or you need some kind of institutional care, or maybe you need home care. And home-based care is where New York really stands out. This is where a caregiver comes into your apartment or your home or your residence. They visit you for a set number of hours per week, and they sometimes they are providing traditional health care. So they're taking your blood pressure, giving you your meds. But there's also this concept called personal care, which is where where this caregiver isn't necessarily trained in any kind of professional way or medical way, but they're there to help you get in and out of bed, get your meals, clean the house, shop, things that because you're disabled, you can't do for yourself. And there was a time when someone with that set of needs would either be dependent on their family or they would be in a nursing home. Those were pretty much the only options. Home care over the past few decades has become increasingly popular, and New York's Medicaid program has invested in it in a really aggressive way. And the thing is that has not replaced nursing home care. We still have a higher than average nursing home population. So I think home care has gone beyond its original purpose. It's not just helping people who are, severely disabled and really can't fend for themselves and don't have family members to help them. It's kind of branching out into a broader variety of people who maybe are less disabled. Maybe they do have some family support and this is supplementing it. And maybe they have resources of their own. Maybe they come from middle class or even a wealthy family, but they've arranged their finances in such a way that they qualify for Medicaid. And so our home-based care provided through Medicaid is just at the top of the charts by almost every measure. And it's the fastest growing part of our Medicaid program.
I'm going to give our listeners some statistics to help them put these numbers in context. Back in November, you reported that New York's spending on personal care was $12 billion per year. And am I correct that about half of that came from the federal government?
Yeah, it's a little over half. It's probably closer to 60%.
Yeah, I just figured I'd
the
flag
thing
that.
about that is that number, I believe, was roughly equal to the other 49 states combined, or like it's some ridiculous amount. It's there's no, like, I guess California has kind of started to catch up with us in this area, but they're twice the size that we are. So, they've got a long way to go.
That was the next statistic I was going to offer. I figured I'd flag that at least half of $12 billion for our listeners in Washington, D.C., who are soon going to be going through the couch cushions to deal with the federal budget deficit. Because it really is amazing that New York is spending basically just as much as the other 49 states combined on this program. It really demands greater scrutiny from the state legislature, which has been fairly hands-off with respect to Medicaid. You would think with this multi-billion-dollar program, you'd have a higher level of oversight from the legislature, but they don't seem to be terribly interested. And this is either party, either conference.
When I first started paying attention to Albany, Medicaid was kind of the annual headache. It was always growing faster than the state could afford. And it was kind of the zeitgeist of Albany was what are we going to do to control Medicaid? There were some voices in the legislature that were, hey, we love Medicaid, we'd like to spend more. But the governor and the legislative leaders kind of joined together every year and tried to figure out a way to rein it in. That really has gone away. The new zeitgeist is, how can we expand Medicaid, and how much more money can we find to spend on it, and how many more benefits can we do, and how much more can we pay the providers? That's the annual discussion. And I think a lot of legislators, they equate Medicaid with healthcare. They think of and I mean, it is the single biggest thing the state does in the area of healthcare. But they focus on that to the exclusion of thinking about the commercial side of the healthcare economy, which also needs their help in the sense of they need the state to back off. They need the state to stop imposing taxes on it, for one thing. They need the state to stop imposing mandates on it that make it more expensive. They need the state to just examine what the providers are doing that's draining so much money from the economy. And instead of thinking about it that way, I think when the average legislator thinks healthcare, they think Medicaid, and the more the better. And so that's been kind of the dynamic of the last few years. It was usually the governor's role to be kind of the bad guy and to say, listen, we resources are limited. We can't be all things to all people in the healthcare world. And actually, in the early part of his term, that was a role that Cuomo took on pretty squarely and had some success in reining in Medicaid's growth. At least he held it pretty flat for his first few years in office. It got a little looser, as time went on. But under Governor Hochul, it's been almost a night and day transition where she has been a cheerleader for expanding Medicaid. She's changed a number of the rules to allow spending to grow faster than it had been growing. So it is growing faster than it has been. And I think they're going to hit a wall on that in next year's budget. I recently wrote about the spending pattern through the first half of this fiscal year, which was at the end of September. Our plan was to spend 13% more on Medicaid this year than last year. That's a remarkably large
That's on purpose.
increase.
That's the plan. That's the plan.
That was the plan.
Deliberately hiking spending 13%.
We are 16% over that target. I'm not sure how that math works out, but we're well over that target, almost $3 billion over that target, just in terms of the state share of the program. That is really setting us up for something like a fiscal crisis, either this year or certainly next year, where the state has to figure out how do we find the money, either how do we find the money to cover that additional spending, or how do we bring that spending under control? That's kind of the dilemma.
Well, and there's just an important distinction here between, we'll say, Medicaid and aid for local school districts, where when we send school aid to local school districts, we make sure we have the money, we cut the check. Sometimes we have to lower that amount of money depending on budgetary situations. With Medicaid, there is no prior authorization. That is to say, someone doesn't go to the doctor, show their Medicaid card, and call, and then have the receptionist call Governor Hochul to make sure there's money available.
Yeah.
We give the care.
No, it's an entitlement. It's what they call an entitlement, meaning there are laws and rules around it. And under those laws and rules, in principle, there is no limit on how much it will spend. So if more people than expected show up and apply and qualify, more people than expected are going to be enrolled. And if they need more healthcare, or if they demand more healthcare than expected, or if costs of that healthcare go up more than expected, it's very difficult for the state to rein that in. Technically, the health commissioner has some authority in that area under a rule that Cuomo put in, but the health commissioner just has never exercised that kind of emergency authority to cut expenses. And it's like, it's kind of the proverbial ocean liner. Once it gets going, it develops a lot of momentum. It's hard to turn it. So if you decide, okay, we're going to shave enrollment here, we're going to trim benefits here, that takes a long time to implement. Often you end up with litigation, pushback. The legislature will rethink things years after you thought they were settled. And so it takes a long time to implement even the consensus reforms. And then to realize any savings takes even longer. And so often what officials will do is resort to kind of ham-handed tactics to control costs, such as across-the-board rate reductions. Another tactic, really unfortunate tactic, that was pioneered by Governor Cuomo is simply not to pay your bills on time. And so in the spring of 2019, his Medicaid spending was the state share was $1.7 billion over budget. And instead of kind of alerting the legislature to this situation and taking action to balance things, he simply postponed paying a month's worth of Medicaid bills, Medicaid premiums to managed care plans. He postponed it by like a week and a half, from late March to early April. So it's technically moving that expense from one fiscal year into the next. What he was really doing, though, is creating a deficit in the next budget, and that became a crisis. And it became he appointed a redesign team to fix the crisis, and that redesign team was still meeting when the coronavirus wave hit New York City. And so postponing the hard decisions on this can really blow up on you. And that was an example of that. And I think we're facing another comparable situation now where spending is growing faster than budgeted and revenues are starting to go soft. We already know we have a multi-billion-dollar deficit next year, and any cost overruns in the Medicaid program are going to add to that.
And we should remind our listeners that Medicaid overrun was coincidentally concurrent with Governor Cuomo proposing that everyone in New York get brand new license plates, which would have raised something in the neighborhood of $60 or $70 million to help cover that deficit. That's probably the way most folks would remember that period of time. But yes, Medicaid was the reason you almost got new license plates in 2019. Bill, I'm glad you mentioned the budget gap. The governor is officially looking at a $9 billion gap between revenues and expenses in the budget that she needs to balance and propose in January. Here at the Empire Center, our calculation puts that budget gap in the neighborhood of $10 billion, and that's without including added costs from the ongoing migrant crisis in New York City. For the people in state government listening, what are your recommendations on what should be done to bring Medicaid costs under control?
I mean, Medicaid has become, as I said, it's become kind of a catch-all for all healthcare. And so a good portion of what constitutes Medicaid spending isn't really about providing care to anybody. One big expense that's in there is keeping healthcare institutions financially afloat. So when a hospital gets into a crisis, we have an example of that now, One Brooklyn Health. It's a 3-hospital network in Brooklyn, all safety net hospitals, all with long-time financial losses. Partly due to the fact that they're serving a lot of low-income people who are on Medicaid, and Medicaid doesn't pay well. They're also serving a lot of underinsured people. But another big factor for them is that they're just losing patients. Their patients are going to other hospitals in other parts of New York City. So they have this structural problem where they can't meet their payroll without a lot of help from the state. And that help flows through the Medicaid program. And so we're literally spending billions of dollars a year, not to provide care to people, but to keep the lights on in institutions that are not financially viable. And if this was just a temporary thing to tide an institution over for a year or two, that would be one thing. These are long-term, they turn into long-term bailouts, that last years and years, sometimes even decades, where a hospital is utterly dependent on these discretionary grants under Medicaid. So that's one area where it would be politically painful, because it would mean allowing money losing institutions to downsize or close, and that's politically unpopular. But that's one area where if you were trying to make Medicaid make more sense, that's something you would do. I would also just try to put a lid on personal care, that form of home care we were talking about before, where our utilization of that is just an outlier compared to other states, including, as you said, other bright blue states like Massachusetts and New Jersey. Were head and shoulders above everybody on that. And so there must be room for savings, some kind of moratorium or freeze, and probably a major intensive audit of what's going on there, because I suspect that there's a certain amount of fraud that explains our high levels of spending in that area. And then I think we just need to, like, Hochul agreed to big rate increases. I'm torn about this, because Medicaid is a terrible payer, but we can't afford to be a good payer. And so I expect that the legislature will be considering some kind of freeze on rates, or even a rollback of the rate increases, simply because they don't have the money to afford them.
Well, we'll have to.
This is one reason why having a big Medicaid program is a mistake in my view. Like letting it get too big, letting it go beyond focus on the real people who need it the most, the indigent and the disabled. It does not pay well. So the providers who treat those people tend to barely break even or lose money on those patients. And to the extent you have more people in that category where they're money losers for their doctors and their hospitals, that's harmful for those doctors and hospitals. If you could get more of those people on commercial insurance, which pays much better, that would ultimately benefit the healthcare economy.
Well, we'll have to come back to the question of why more people can't afford private insurance in New York, or care without insurance in New York, or all right, we've got the next 4 podcasts together teed up. In the meantime, thank you for what you do. You are the single best Medicaid watchdog in New York, and I encourage folks to follow you on Twitter. Make sure you're getting our emails. Please subscribe to our podcast. I appreciate you listening today and joining us. Thank you, as always, for your support of the Empire Center. And with that, we adjourn this message of necessity.
For more news and analysis, visit our website and sign up for email updates at empirecenter.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Empire Center.